Hi friends, Emily here from Homemade Emily Jane. Today I'm going to share with you exactly how to hand bind a quilt. So there are a few different ways to hand bind a quilt, and I actually have another tutorial for machine binding. Check it out here if you don't want to do hand stitching. But in this video I'm going to show you how to bind a quilt using hand stitches, two different ways. The first way is using invisible stitches and the second way is big stitch hand binding. So if you're interested in learning both of those, stay tuned. But before we dive into the actual hand stitching portion, let's talk about binding a quilt in general for any beginners out there. If you are binding a quilt, there are a couple of things that you need to do before you can actually start stitching the binding on. So first off, you'll want to prep your quilt. So that might mean squaring it up and trimming off any excess batting and backing. I personally also like to serge around the edges of my quilt. This is totally optional, personal preference, but I find that it's a little easier to work with if I have those edges secured. If you don't have a serger, you might also just do a straight stitch or a zigzag stitch around the edges of your quilt too. That works fine. Once you have prepped your quilt, you also need to make your binding. So I always start off by cutting 2.5 inch width of fabric strips, as many as you need to get around the edges of your quilt. If you're following a quilt pattern, it'll probably tell you how many strips to cut. I personally like to use a Stripology XL ruler. Rulers like these are really nice to have, but not essential. I'll drop a link in the description below if you want to check it out for yourself. I really love mine and use it all the time for creating binding. Once you've cut out your strips, you're ready to sew them together. I sew them together using a sewing machine and sew them together at a 90-degree angle so that it's a diagonal seam. Sewing the seam on the diagonal means that there's less bulk in one place on your quilt binding. It spreads it out over a couple inches. It also makes your seam more secure and strong. So that's definitely the recommended way. I use the laser on my sewing machine. It's a fancy little tool to make sure that I get straight corners every time. If your machine does not have a laser, you can just draw a line using a pencil or a chalk or whatever your preferred marking tool is. So once you've sewn all of your strips together, right sides together on the diagonal, you'll go ahead and trim off the excess. I like to leave a 1/4 inch for seam allowance. And then you can start pressing those seams open and then folding your binding in half. So once you're done, your binding will be about 1.25 inches wide, but 2 layers with a fold. You'll see here I roll mine. So once my binding is pressed, I roll it up. So it makes a little cinnamon roll just like this. Once your binding is completely ready to go and your quilt top is prepped, let's go ahead and start sewing our binding onto our quilt at our sewing machine. The process for hand binding your quilt actually starts off by sewing the binding onto the front edge of your quilt using your sewing machine. This is super necessary because it gets it on there nice and sturdy. I like to use my walking foot while doing this because there are a lot of layers of this quilt and binding going through your machine. So using an even feed or dual feed or a walking foot, anything like that will help pull those layers through simultaneously. I'll go ahead and show you how I stitch the binding on with my machine right now. When you are at your sewing machine ready to sew, go ahead and thread it with a thread that matches your binding and in the bobbin as well, or maybe just a neutral color. And then make sure that you have your walking foot on your machine, a nice sharp needle, and then I like to roll my binding like this and stick it on an extra thread pin if I have a spool pin up at the top, and then I can feed it on very easily. I can just drag it off of the spool pin. We will line up the raw edges of the binding with the raw edges of the quilt and leave about 1 foot tail, so we're not stitching for about 1 foot, just to have some room to join the edges later. And stitch using roughly maybe 1/4 inch or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance to get the binding attached to the front of the quilt. You can begin by stitching a few inches and then folding it over, and using feel, make sure that the binding will wrap around to cover the stitches on the back. If you're good with that seam allowance, then go ahead and stitch all the way to the corner of the quilt. Go ahead and stitch until you are at least 1/4 inch away from the edge of the quilt. So you'll see here, I'm stopping before I actually stitch off the edge, and I'm gonna rotate so that I stitch off the corner diagonally. And then without cutting my threads, I just shift the quilt over, and you can see I've got some diagonal stitches there. I'm gonna pull the binding straight up so that the edge of the binding is parallel with this new quilt edge, and create a finger crease there. And then fold it straight down so that that fold is parallel with the top of the quilt, the side that I've already sewn. So now we have here a perfect corner that can fold either direction. And that's what we need for a mitered corner on the other side. So go ahead and put your quilt back underneath your needle and stitch straight down. Once we've gotten a little further away, I can show you what this looks like when we unfold it. You can see that we're going to have a nice crisp corner there, and then we can fold it over on the opposite side to have the same crisp corner on the back. And that's exactly what we want when making a quilt. So now go ahead and finish stitching all around the 4 corners of the quilt until we get close to where the ends will meet. Once you've stitched the binding all the way around your quilt, you'll have some tails left over. We can join those tails pretty easily. Just watch this quick little bit. So what we'll do is we'll actually stitch in place to reinforce our seam and then cut the thread. Once the thread is cut, we can actually take it over to our cutting mat, or we can actually do it right here at the sewing machine. We're gonna make it so that the overlap of the 2 pieces of binding is the same width that we cut our strips. So for me, 2.5 inches. You'll see here, I really cut it pretty close. I don't have a ton of room to play with. I do have enough overlap for 2.5 inches, but I really don't have much to trim off, so I got lucky there. I'll go ahead and grab my scissors and trim off the selvage of the one end, and then I will lay the other piece on top and grab a little ruler, or I could use the ruler on my machine, but I'm just so used to using a quilting ruler. So I measured 2.5 inches, and I take a look at where that piece hits that, and then I trim the other piece so that there are 2.5 inches of overlap. So you'll trim so that there are 2.5 inches of overlap between the 2 binding pieces. And this is where things can get a little bit tricky, so hang in there with me. We're going to arrange them so that the right sides of the binding are facing each other and they're meeting at a perpendicular angle. So we're basically creating a bias seam. And before we go ahead and stitch it across, you can take a pin and pin it exactly where you will be stitching. I like to use 2 pins for this to create like the full seam. So in theory we would stitch diagonally here, but if you pin it in place and pull it, you can see if you have any twists or turns in your binding. This looks like how we want it to look. So we are set with this placement. Keep the pins in if you want, just make sure you don't sew over them. I'm going to turn the laser on my machine, but of course if you want to draw a diagonal line, that works too. And we'll just stitch on the diagonal, being sure to pull those pins out. And now we can go ahead and check and make sure that nothing got crazy, everything is still nice and straight. And then we'll go ahead and trim off some of this excess. So just like I did on the individual binding strips, I'll trim so that it's about 1/4 inch. It doesn't have to be perfect. Next, you can either use your iron or your fingers, but just press that seam open and then pull the binding nice and taut. And then we'll go ahead and stitch the binding down the rest of the way. And now that we've sewn the binding all the way around the edges of the quilt, we are ready to flip it over and start hand stitching. So this is where you'll get to choose whether you want to use invisible stitches or bold, big stitches like a hand quilting look on the edges of your binding. I've done it both ways, and honestly, I love both. I find the big stitches to be a little bit quicker. Of course, not as fast as doing it by machine, but you still get that extra texture to it, which is a lot of fun. I definitely recommend trying out both and seeing which way you like best. Now, one tip that you might want to do before stitching the binding in place by hand is to actually use a hot iron and press the edges of your binding up and away so that it's a little bit easier to fold over the edge of the quilt. But that's not necessary either. I personally just grab clips and clip the binding in place so that it's ready for my hand stitching. Before we start hand stitching, we'll need to gather our supplies. We'll definitely need a little pair of snips like these to cut our threads. Depending on if you're going to do invisible stitches or big stitches, you will need the correct type of thread. If you are planning on doing invisible stitches, you'll want to use a strong but thin thread that will blend into both the backing and the binding fabric that you're using on your quilt. Any thin but strong thread will do. I am going to use this really fun Deco Bob by Wonderfelt. It's super strong and super lightweight. You can barely even see it when it's pulled out. So that's what I would recommend for invisible stitches. But if you wanted to do something big and bulky, I love this 8-weight pearl cotton thread. You could also use 12-weight or embroidery floss. And then you'll need the correct needle for each one of those. So I've got in here just a whole bunch of needles, some big ones for the nice thick thread or some littler ones for the invisible thread. So find a needle that you like that's nice and sharp. I definitely recommend getting something like this to hold your needles in. And then of course you will need a thimble, something like this or this one with a metal plate. I really enjoy the leather ones because they fit me a little bit better. I put my thimble on my right hand middle finger and I'm right-handed. So hopefully that helps figure out thimble placement for you. Additionally, I like to use Wonder Clips to clip my binding in place. That's optional, or maybe even a needle threader like this one, which is also optional too. So those are the tools that I would recommend grabbing for hand binding your quilt. If there are any tools that you use for hand binding as well that I forgot to mention, be sure to drop them in the comments below so that other quilters can learn too. Once you have all of your supplies, you're ready to start hand sewing your binding onto your quilt. For this tutorial, I'm going to start off by showing you how to do it with the invisible stitches. But before we begin, I'll go ahead and clip my binding in place. So you'll see I just pulled it over from the front to the back. I'm folding it over to make sure that it covers up that stitching line from where we sewed the binding onto the front. And then I'll also do a clip here at the corner. We're going to go straight and then we're going to fold it down to get that mitered corner on the front and on the back of the quilt. Just like that. Once your clips are in place, you can go ahead and grab your thread. I'm using this super thin, lightweight thread that's going to blend in very easily for some invisible stitches. And then a very thin needle as well to suit the needs of the thread. So go ahead and thread your needle and then leave a tail that's longer on one end than the other. You don't need to tie a knot at the end, but you can if you want to. So we're actually going to start out a little bit further down here. And like I mentioned, you don't need to tie a knot in your thread because we're going to tie the knot directly into this little space of backing fabric. So go ahead and make a knot inside the binding on the backing of the quilt. Go ahead and loop it through a couple times and then loop it under to make it nice and taut so that that's not going anywhere. And then we'll go ahead and fold the binding fabric over, and we're going to come up straight where we have the thread and grab just a couple little strands of your binding and pull it on through. That's going to be your first stitch. Now that we have the first stitch done, we're going to put the needle down into the backing fabric, and then we're going to come up about 1/4 inch or maybe a little less away and put it up through that binding. Go ahead and push your needle through and pull it up, and then we repeat that same process, coming straight down from the binding into the backing, up into the binding, down into the backing, up into the binding, grabbing just a little bit each time. So that is how you do the binding by hand for the invisible stitch. You can go ahead and carry that all the way around the quilt. But now I'm going to teach you how to do it for the big stitch hand quilting. So I'll go ahead and switch out my needle here. I'm going to use one that fits that pearl cotton really well. So I already have a needle that had it on it, so I can grab the needle out and get a fresh piece of thread. For using the needle threader, you will go ahead and stick the needle threader through the eye of the needle and then thread the big thread through that and then pull it through. And then we have it nice and threaded. So now if you're doing the big stitch hand quilting, I do recommend tying a knot at the edge of your thread. And then we'll go ahead and stick it in. We're gonna stick it right into the backing like we did the previous one. And now we actually want it to show up. So we're gonna come up through the binding and we're gonna start making some big stitches. So you'll go down and then back up, but only grabbing some little bit in the middle, not actually coming all the way through to the front of the quilt. And you can pull that through, and there's your first big stitch binding. And go ahead and repeat that over and over again. You can do one stitch at a time, or you might even try to get a couple on your needle. But the real goal is to try to get them to look as even as possible. So that's what the big stitch hand quilting binding will look like. Alternatively, we have our invisible stitches here. So you can choose whichever method works best for you. Did you learn something new in this tutorial? I would love to hear which way is your favorite, either doing the invisible hand stitches or the big bold hand quilting stitches, or maybe you prefer to do it all by machine. Either way, drop a comment below and let me know which binding method is your personal favorite. Thanks for watching this quilting tutorial about how to hand bind your quilt. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, be sure to check out homadeemilyjane.com and find me on other social media channels as well.